The member for Pascoe Vale.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Land Revocation Reservations Bill of 2023. And from the outset, I just want to acknowledge that as the member for Pascoe, Coburg and Brunswick West, I don't have any parcels of land directly included in this bill. However, I do certainly have a number of case studies that are definitely related and contextual for those communities that are directly impacted, both historically and prospectively, that I will be touching on in due course. Speaker, in Victoria, Crown land can be reserved either temporarily or permanently, and while temporarily reserved land may be revoked through an administrative process, permanent reservations may only be revoked by an Act of Parliament. Acts which revoke permanent reservations are a normal part of government business, and Parliament has passed such acts in the past. This bill will therefore seek to facilitate new management arrangements, new future uses and new development of relevant areas of land. The bill seeks to achieve this by revoking permanent reservations at 13 locations across Victoria, as well as 6 corresponding restricted Crown grants. Future uses across these sites may include re-reservations in some cases, continued use by existing occupiers and potential sale and development. In doing so, it is very important to note that in Victoria, the sale of Crown land is subject to a range of Victorian government legislative and policy requirements, including Strategic Crown Land Assessment Policy, the Land Transaction Policy and the Land Holding Policy and Guidelines. And additionally, any sale must adhere to the obligations under the Native Title Act of 1993, which are at a Commonwealth level, and under relevant agreements made under the Traditional Owner Settlement Act of 2010. The bill therefore seeks the following Crown land revocations, including Victoria Park Lake in Shepparton, which is in the member for Shepparton's electorate, and we actually had the great opportunity as part of the Economic and Infrastructure Committee earlier this year to travel to Shepparton for a public hearing on the road safety inquiry, and it is looking pretty marvellous up in Shepparton, particularly with the investment in the new art gallery and the like. The former potato research station in Talangi, in the member for Ilden's electorate, with that research station being closed or decommissioned as of 2008, this bill will help free up the future use of that land. Merriman Creek in Seaspray, in the member for Gippsland South electorate, I believe, with the bill to revoke a small area of land permanently reserved for the site for public purposes along the banks of the creek. And the bill will also revoke 5 redundant permanent reservations for mechanics institutes at 4 locations in eastern Victoria as well as in the west. And I understand that the mechanics institutes have not functioned for many years, and there are no buildings or structures on these reserves, with the land now used for a range of purposes, including pine plantations, grazing and as part of surrounding state forests. The bill will also revoke a redundant permanent reservation at the Port of Geelong, and it also revoked part of the permanent reservation of the Borough Chambers Reserve in Clunes as well, that Wesley College, Melbourne, currently leases as a residential college. A small area of Alexandra Park in Melbourne on the banks of the Yarra in South Yarra will also be revoked via this bill to reflect the legal status of the land in its current use as part of the upgraded Swan Street Bridge, which has played a big role in alleviating congestion through that corridor, as I'm sure we can all appreciate. And the bill will also revoke the permanent reservation for public baths and wash houses over a very small area of the Melbourne City Baths Reserve. According to the City of Melbourne, the relevant area located on the corner of Swanson and Franklin Streets has, since the time of the land's reservation in 1878, never been used for the reserved purposes and only used as a road. And finally, and additionally, the bill will revoke the reservation over certain land permanently reserved for public purposes along the banks of Stringers Creek in Walhalla, in the member for Narracans electorate, I believe, and it relates to several dwellings along the creek. And through this bill, the revocation of 13 permanent reservations and 6 restricted Crown grants, it will enable appropriate use for the relevant lands, providing certainty to communities and affected individuals. Acting Speaker, generally, Crown land is owned by the Commonwealth Government or State Government, with most Crown land in Victoria owned by the Victorian Government. As set out previously by the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, the old DWALP, about 1/3 of Victorian land is Crown land, 8 million hectares in over 10,000 parcels of land. Of this land, approximately 50% of Crown land in Victoria is a national or state park, 39% is state forest, 4% is unreserved or Australian government managed Crown land, and 7% or 550,000 hectares is Crown reserves. Crown reserves include many of our public schools, universities, TAFE colleges, public hospitals, mental health and other community services, our cemeteries, municipal buildings and land, public roads, government railways, parks, community halls, recreation reserves and even racecourses. And Acting Speaker, some of the earliest Crown reservations and land subdivisions in this state and colony's history actually took place in my community, which I would like to touch on to provide some context again for those communities which are impacted by this bill. Acting Speaker, shortly after the arrival of John Batman and John Pascoe Faulkner on the banks of the Yarra in 1835, who established what is now Melbourne on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, my area was first actually surveyed by Robert Hoddle, the person who granted Melbourne its distinctively ordered grid layout, sometime around 1837 or 1838. Through this surveying, a 327-acre reservation was established for a village to be served by two distinct local roads, Bell Street West and what would later be called Sydney Road. The Pentridge name would become later in 1840 when surveyor Henry Foote named the area for the birthplace of his wife, Pentridge in Dorset in England. And we heard the member for Hastings earlier actually give a big shout out to his wife, but I'm not sure if he's yet to name a city after his wife, like Henry Foote did here in Coburg in Pentridge. 10 years later, in December 1850, in response to a burgeoning crime rate driven by Victorian gold rush, the Pentridge Stockade was established with an initial population of 16 prisoners who were transferred from the overflowing Melbourne Jail in Russell Street. By 1850, there were 20 farms in the area and land reserved for places of worship and other future community needs which still stand and are utilised for their original purposes to this day, including St Paul's Parish and Coburg Primary School. Bluestone quarries began opening during this early era, and the increasing number of prisoners at the newly conceived Her Majesty's Pentridge were put to work breaking up the very stones that would later go towards building the very prison they were incarcerated in and towards the construction of Sydney Road. By the end of the 19th century, Coburg was home to 41 quarries that had been reserved for such purposes, and one such former quarry would later become Coburg Lake, when the area now called Lake Reserve was purchased in 1912 and a weir constructed to form a man-made lake contained by Balsic rock and outcroppings. The bluestone drawn out of these quarries, including from Coburg Lake, very much remain ever present across the streets and the laneways of my community and still stand just as resilient and tall through the walls of Pentridge Prison to this very day, and very much have played an important role in shaping the character, identity and culture of Melbourne's northern suburbs. Coburg Lake, for example, continues to also be enjoyed by many across the community on a daily basis thanks to its ongoing reservation for community benefit. For example, just last Sunday, on the 26th of November, the member for Broadmeadows and I attended the Alevi community's 30th anniversary festival at Coburg Lake. Supported by the Victorian Labor government, the festival is a wonderful celebration of all things Alevi, including food, music and culture. And I pay tribute to Minister Stitt, Minister Erdogan, for having attended, and I pay tribute to the dedicated long-time volunteers of the entire Alevi community, including the President of the Alevi Federation of Australia, Susan Saka, President of the Alevi Community Council, Hussein Dumain, President of the Dandenong Alevi Cultural Centre, Surda Dazoglu, and all of the volunteers. Speaker, another example I'd like to draw the House's attention to as well relate to the utilisation of land in my community, which also can provide some further context, relates to the Robertson Reserve and Reynard Street neighbourhood house in West Coburg. Originally, however, the site was a long-time army barracks and drill hall, and its story on how the land was returned to community is an illustration of how sometimes the good work of a nifty local councillor can help uncover some positive outcomes. This reserve of land was part of the original Crown portion 140 and owned by the original Crown grantee John Pascoe Faulkner before changing ownership a number of times to the Metropolitan Permanent Building Society, who then sold it to the old borough of Coburg in 1908. In 1912, the Army accepted the then Coburg Borough Council's offer of the land for a drill hall at a peppercorn rent of $1 per year for 500 years. A 500-year community lease on community land, Speaker, for an Army drill hall. And the hall was erected for £1,500 for the 59th Regiment, and it was opened in 1914 by the then Defence Minister, Senator Miller. And 2 years after the council agreed to the 500-year lease, which would be controversial in today's standards by any means, the Register of Titles in the state of Victoria questioned the legality of such a lease and refused to sign it. An application was made to the High Court to compel the Register of Titles to register the lease, but the court dismissed the application. However, in 1975, it was then Labor councillor Murray Gavin, whose son Paul Gavin, who still volunteers for me to this very day and does an amazing job, continued to pursue the matter and discovered it was illegal for councils to lease land for longer than 10 years. So after some, what I can imagine, very interesting and very considerable, extensive conversations, the Army was eventually asked to vacate the site. And according to the Coburg Historical Society, the Army originally wanted a local sporting body to take over the site, but the council decided the reserve should be returned to residents for community use, where the reserve and the hall were later officially opened in 1988. And just on the 18th of November, I was very happy to represent the Minister for Suburban Development to officially unveil the latest chapter in the rich history of the site by opening up the revitalised Reynard Street Robinson Reserve Park, Play and Recreational Space. It was a $420,000 project made possible by a $178,000 Labor government contribution, and as a former chair of the House who oversaw the strategic plan of the site to integrate the house back with the park, I was delighted to be there to officially open it and put it back to good community use, so I commend the bill in that context.